Maduro just made the biggest strategic mistake of his presidency. Venezuela challenged a U.S. Navy ship, and the consequences have been devastating.
Y prepararnos para ganar la soberanía y la paz en cualquier circunstancia que se presente.
Today you're going to find out how one impulsive decision from Maduro almost triggered an international conflict, why the Americans placed their warships right at Venezuela's doorstep, and what the humiliating response from the Venezuelan regime had to be. This is the full story of how Venezuela tried to face the world's biggest military power and failed in spectacular fashion. To really get what's happening right now, we got to rewind a few weeks. Back in August 2025, the Trump administration announced one of the biggest military mobilizations in the Caribbean in recent times. We're not talking one or two ships here, but a full-on combat fleet. 3 main ships were sent on this mission: the USS Gravely, the USS Jason Dunham, and the USS Sampson, all destroyers armed with state-of-the-art guided missile systems. But that's not all. The Americans also deployed 3 amphibious assault ships: the USS San Antonio, the USS Iwo Jima, and the USS Fort Lauderdale. That's a military force of about 4,500 troops, including 2,200 highly trained Marines. What makes this operation even more impressive is the firepower they brought along. These ships carry helicopters, P-8 patrol planes, and some of them can even launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, the same ones we see in action movies, capable of hitting targets hundreds of miles away with pinpoint accuracy. The official excuse? Fighting drug trafficking and criminal organizations in the region. But anyone who knows geopolitics understands that when you park a military fleet of this size near another country's waters, the message goes way beyond just an anti-drug mission. And sure enough, on September 3rd, that show of force turned into real action. A suspicious boat was spotted leaving Venezuelan waters, allegedly loaded with illegal substances and carrying members of the Tren de Aragua cartel, one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in Latin America. What happened next is still debated. According to U.S. sources, the vessel refused to stop when ordered and was treated as a threat. U.S. naval forces opened fire, killing 11 people on board. Donald Trump, in his usual blunt style, personally confirmed the attack on his social media, calling the dead terrorists linked to drug trafficking. But here's where things get interesting. International critics questioned whether there was really enough evidence that the boat was loaded with drugs, or if it was just a hasty move that turned into an extrajudicial execution. The Venezuelan government, of course, called the attack an unprovoked act of aggression in international waters. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was crystal clear, saying this was just the beginning. In his own words, "This is a dead serious mission for us," hinting that more of these actions could follow. Nicolas Maduro wasn't about to sit still. Venezuela's response was quick and, according to the Pentagon, highly provocative. On September 4th, just one day after the boat attack, 2 Venezuelan military jets deliberately flew over U.S. ships in international waters. For anyone who doesn't know military protocol, that's considered a serious provocation. When one country's warplanes buzz another country's warships, even in international waters, it's seen as intimidation and can be interpreted as prep for an attack. The U.S. Defense Department immediately labeled the move as interference in anti-narcotics and counterterrorism operations. But Maduro went even further. He immediately mobilized the National Militia, a paramilitary force made up of hundreds of thousands of armed civilians trained by the government. Military analysts saw this as Venezuela signaling it's ready to respond to any further escalation. Trump, in turn, cranked the tension up another notch with a statement that made diplomats worldwide sit up straight. The U.S. president openly promised to shoot down Venezuelan military aircraft if they posed any threat to American forces. We're talking about the President of the United States threatening to directly take out another sovereign country's planes. And in the middle of all this rising tension, Pete Hegseth made a move that showed just how seriously the U.S. is taking this situation. On September 8th, the Defense Secretary made a surprise, unannounced visit to Puerto Rico, alongside General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That visit wasn't random. Puerto Rico is a key strategic hub in the Caribbean. It's basically a U.S. military base just a few hundred miles from Venezuela. While there, Hegseth delivered a personal message from Trump to 300 soldiers at the Muniz Air National Guard base near San Juan. But the real bombshell was the announcement that the U.S. is deploying 10 Marine Corps F-35 fighter jets to Puerto Rico. For those who don't know, the F-35 is one of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, stealth tech that makes radar detection tough, and the ability to strike with precision. Puerto Rico's governor, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, didn't mince words about the island's role. We are America's frontier with the Caribbean. And that line sums up perfectly why this region has become so important to the Trump administration. And here's the big question. How much of this is really about fighting drug trafficking, and how much is just a convenient excuse for geopolitical pressure? The numbers on drug trafficking are definitely worrying. Around 80% of the cocaine that makes it to the U.S. is estimated to pass through Caribbean routes, many of them starting out near Venezuelan waters. The Tren Aragua cartel mentioned in the September 3rd attack really is a powerful international criminal organization. But foreign policy experts point out some inconsistencies in the official story. If this was purely an anti-drug operation, why not coordinate with specialized international organizations? Why not involve other regional countries that are also affected? The way the operation was set up, with combat ships loaded with long-range missiles instead of vessels specialized in drug interdiction, suggests goals that go way beyond just cracking down on traffickers. It's like using a wrecking ball to hammer a nail. Sure, it works, but you probably have other intentions. The international response has been cautious, but telling. Countries that are usually close U.S. allies in the region have stayed diplomatically quiet, avoiding open support or outright criticism. Take Brazil, for example. With its complicated ties to both the U.S. and Venezuela, Brazil kept it vague, just talking about respecting national sovereignty and resolving conflicts through dialogue. That kind of careful neutrality shows the tightrope South American nations walk when big powers flex their military muscles in the region. Russia and China, on the other hand, were way more direct, blasting what they called unilateral military interference in Latin America. Moscow even hinted it could boost its military presence in Venezuela if things keep heating up, a warning Washington definitely noticed. International bodies like the OAS, Organization of American States, are in an especially awkward spot since many member nations depend heavily on the U.S. economically, but they're also nervous about the precedent of unilateral military action. Looking at this strategically, it's clear this is way more than a drug bust operation. This is the Trump administration showing it's ready to use military force to reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Choosing Venezuela as the target is no coincidence. It's a country with an authoritarian government, diplomatically isolated in the region, but rich in natural resources and aligned with America's geopolitical rivals. In other words, it's the perfect target for a show of force that sends multiple messages at once. For Venezuela, the message is simple. Your alliance with Russia and China comes with consequences, and the U.S. is willing to bring military pressure when its interests are threatened. For other countries in the region, it's a reminder that crossing Washington can come at a steep price. But maybe the most important audience is the domestic one. Trump campaigned on a tougher foreign policy and on delivering real results in the war on drugs. This operation lets him check both boxes, showing decisive action and giving his political base the kind of strongman display they love. So where does this go from here? Looking at history and recent statements from both sides, there are basically three possible scenarios. First is controlled escalation. In this case, both countries would keep ramping up military presence and tough talk, but without crossing the red lines that would trigger direct conflict. That would mean more shows of force, more incidents like Venezuelan jets buzzing ships, maybe more attacks on suspicious boats. Dangerous, but it lets both sides score political points without catastrophic fallout. Second is negotiated de-escalation. That would happen if international pressure or economic concerns push both countries toward a diplomatic way out. Could be some kind of agreement on anti-drug operations, territorial concessions, or changes in Venezuela's foreign policy. Historically, that's how most international crises end, when the costs of conflict outweigh the benefits. Third, and most worrying, is uncontrolled escalation. A miscalculation by either side, a more serious incident, or internal political pressure could push things into direct military confrontation. Considering both leaders have tough guy reputations to maintain, and with elections and economic crises in play, this can't be ruled out. The economic ripple effects of this tension are already being felt across the region. Oil prices have been volatile whenever news breaks of further escalation, since markets fear disruption of Venezuelan supply or broader regional instability. Caribbean nations that depend on commercial shipping routes are especially on edge. A heavier military presence could disrupt trade flows, jack up insurance costs for vessels, and rattle tourism, a lifeline for many local economies. For Brazil and other South American countries, it's a tough strategic balancing act. They've got to manage ties with the U.S., worries about regional sovereignty, and the real drug trafficking problem that hits them too. Venezuela's instability has already sent millions of refugees across borders, and a military showdown could multiply that crisis fast. International oil companies still operating in Venezuela are reassessing risk. Planned investments could be scrapped, and existing operations might get suspended if the military situation spirals. One fascinating part of all this is how it shows modern military confrontation works in the 21st century. U.S. ships in the region are loaded with surveillance and comm systems that let them track almost everything happening in real time. Those P-8 spy planes mentioned earlier can spot and track vessels hundreds of miles away, using radar, advanced optics, and signal interception. Basically, no suspicious boat can operate in the area without the Americans noticing. On the other side, Venezuela has Russian-made air defense systems, including S-300 missiles capable of hitting high-altitude aircraft. That means any U.S. airstrike escalation would face serious defenses, raising risks and costs of military action. Cyber warfare is also part of the game. Both countries can mess with each other's comms, navigation, and control systems, adding a whole new layer of conflict beyond just physical clashes. To better understand where this might lead, it's worth looking at past U.S. confrontations in Latin America. The 1983 invasion of Grenada, the 1989 intervention in Panama, and the Colombia ops in the 2000s all show some patterns. In every case, the U.S. justified action with drugs, terrorism, or protecting American citizens while chasing broader geopolitical goals. The big difference here is that today's Venezuela is way more militarily capable than those past targets, and it's got powerful allies. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis is another worrying parallel. Back then, we had a nuclear power, the USSR, backing a Latin American ally against U.S. pressure. The difference now is multiple nuclear powers, China too, are involved, making strategy way more complicated. The 1982 Falklands War also matters here. It showed how fast regional conflicts can escalate when leaders feel they need to prove toughness at home. Both Trump and Maduro face internal pressure that could push them to make more dramatic moves than originally planned. What started as a so-called anti-drug op has morphed into one of the most complex military shows of force in years. With U.S. combat ships patrolling international waters, F-35s being deployed strategically, and leaders on both sides tossing around direct threats, we're clearly in uncharted territory. The big question is whether decision-makers on both sides will have the wisdom to keep this from spinning out of control. Because when you've got thousands of armed troops with cutting-edge gear operating in close quarters under high political tension, the room for error is massive. One thing's for sure, no matter how this ends, it's already changed the security dynamics in the Caribbean and set new rules for confrontation between regional and global powers. And this is just the beginning of a story that's still being written. We'll keep following this evolving situation and bringing you all the updates and analysis as new developments come in. Because if there's one thing we know, it's that this story still has many chapters left.